Everything you need to know about 1984, Part 2, Chapter 10. Congratulations on making it through Part 2, Chapter 9 and still wanting to finish the book. Pat yourself on the back or something. This significant chapter is the last chapter before Part 3 begins. So if you remember, at the beginning of Part 2, there was a major turn of events when Winston started his relationship with Julia. And we can look, because we're going into Part 3, for another shift in the plot as we head toward the end of the novel. So at the end of the last chapter, Winston was falling asleep after having read out of Goldstein's book for a while. He restates at the end of the last chapter that he understood how the government controlled the population, but he still didn't grasp why they did it. So he wakes up at the beginning of chapter 10 feeling like he's slept a while, but the clock reads 20:30 in military time, which would be 6:30 on the clock. He has a 12-hour clock in the room above Charrington's shop. So that's a clue that something could be off. As Winston lays there, the prole woman outside in the courtyard starts singing one of the songs that the party put out as she does laundry. Julia is woken up by it, and she gets up to make some coffee, but she sees that the stove has gone out and the water is cold and the oil in the stove is gone, and she had been sure she had filled it up. So she notices it seems colder too. Winston gets up and looks out the window to see the light has changed in the courtyard and the stones seem wet. So there's a lot of clues here that something is different. He shifts his attention to the woman doing laundry. She's at least 50 and fat and solid, like she's a prole that's been hardened by a difficult life and a lot of hard work. Winston remarks a little oddly maybe that she's beautiful, and Julia reminds him, well, she's huge. And he's like, that's her style of beauty. He stands there with his arm around Julia's waist, and he's reminded that they can never have a child like the proles are free to do. They can only pass on what they know in words. So in his thoughts, Winston then gets kind of philosophical about the proles, thinking that the conclusion of Goldstein's book must say that the proles are the answer, that at some point in the future they're going to overthrow the party, even if it's in like 1,000 years. But Winston and Julia and others in the party, they are dead, and the proles are alive, and the proles are the future. When Winston says out loud, "We are the dead," which he says a lot, Julia repeats it, but this time a metallic voice behind them says it too. They know they've been caught, so they kind of spring apart, and Winston feels like he has ice running through him. He can see that Julia has gone like totally pale. She whispers, "It was behind the picture," meaning the telescreen, and the voice repeats her so it can hear everything she's saying and tells them not to move until they're told, and Winston realizes it's starting. Their arrest and their capture by the party is starting. They hear a crash as the picture falls to the floor and it reveals the telescreen. Julia says they can be seen now, and the voice repeats her, telling them to stand in the middle of the room, back to back, with their hands behind their heads without touching. So Winston can hear boots outside, and the singing woman is stopped, and he hears shouts and stuff, and Winston remarks that they're surrounded and should say their goodbyes, and of course the metallic voice repeats everything they say, and then another voice adds a line from the poem Winston's been preoccupied with and says, "Here comes a candle to light you to bed, here comes a chopper to chop off your head." At this point, a ladder comes through the window, someone's climbing in, and people come up the stairs until the room is full of men in black uniforms with metal-toed boots and clubs in their hands. Winston stays as still as possible to avoid being hit. Someone smashes the glass paperweight with the coral inside of it onto the ground, and it shatters. Julia gets punched in the stomach and on her way down to the floor kicks Winston's ankle. He doesn't move, but he sometimes sees her as she's rolling around on the ground trying to catch her breath until two guards pick her up and carry her out. Standing there not moving, Winston briefly notices that he has to pee, and it's getting brighter out, and he just wonders, did we sleep through the night? Is it really 6:30 in the morning? That's probably likely based on the clues we've already seen. Mr. Charrington, he comes into the room and the soldiers kind of give him respect, right? He looks younger though, and he's lost his thick accent. When Charrington sees the broken paperweight, he orders someone to pick it up, and Winston realized that it was the voice from the telescreen that recited the line of poetry. And when he looks at Charrington, he can see just a shift and change in him, and Winston realized that Charrington is a member of the Thought Police. And that's how the chapter ends. So what are we supposed to take from this chapter? There's a couple things. For one, turning point in the story's progression. It's one Winston knew was coming all along. The reader, as we read this, we've been waiting for this as well because it's been in Winston's thoughts since the very beginning of the novel. We also revisit the idea of what Winston believes to be the only hope in defeating the party, the proles, the lower class, that they will eventually come together and rebel. Winston knows he is trapped and doomed, that he and Julia will not be a part of the party's overthrow except in the knowledge in their brain that they are right and the party is wrong. Although they're captured here, right? There are a lot of questions that come up in this chapter. How long had they been asleep? How long had they been watched and spied on? Was the telescreen behind the painting from the very beginning since he went upstairs in the shop? Who was involved in their capture? What's going to happen to O'Brien? What's about Charrington? I mean, some of these questions are answered, but there's a lot more that are kind of raised from this. Clearly, they had slept through the entire night. The oil had burned up, the water on the stove was cold, the light changed outside, it had possibly rained. We don't know if it was because they were exhausted or that the Thought Police had done something to keep them asleep until they were ready to capture them. We also discover the true identity of Charrington as a member of the Thought Police, and we assume it's the same man, but that he'd been kind of made up into character the whole time. And like, it boggles the mind. Did they get him ready when they knew Winston was coming? We realize what an elaborate trap was set for Winston. He'd known Charrington since before the beginning of the book when he bought the diary, and by this point, that was years ago, like 7 years. It's disturbing how long they've been spying and gathering information on Winston. And then another important moment is the breaking of that paperweight with the coral inside. If you remember, that paperweight is a symbol of the little world and the little pocket of safety that Winston and Julia were living in. And as it was glass, right, it's fragile, and what was inside the coral was delicate as well. The breaking of the paperweight kind of coincides with the destruction of Winston and Julia's kind of fragile and temporary little bubble they'd been living in when they keep Charrington's upstairs room for themselves. So that's the chapter. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask them in the comments. We're so glad you watched this video, and we'd love it if you could like, subscribe, and share this with other people that might need the help. All right, until next time, thanks for watching.